The freeze lasted 9 seconds, on live television, with the tweets on the screen behind her head. By the time the segment cut to commercial, the clip had already left the building, not slowly, in the specific, immediate, horizontal velocity of something that has been given the exact frame that makes it impossible to scroll past. Not because of the freeze, because of what preceded it. Because Jasmine Crockett had not editorialized, had not raised her voice, had not reached for rhetoric or performance. She had done something more devastating to a woman whose entire professional identity is the management of live rooms. She had read. She had picked up the printed sheet, looked at Leavitt across the desk, and read the words back in the voice of someone reading a document. Not Crockett's words. Not Democratic Party talking points. Leavitt's own words, verbatim, in the register in which they had been written, which is the register that matters most when the author is sitting across the table from you and cannot claim the words belong to someone else. 9 seconds of freeze. That is the archaeology of the evening's central moment. What built it took 23 minutes. The format was a debate panel. 4 seats, 2 principals, 2 commentators, live broadcast, the specific configuration that political television uses when it wants to create the impression of balance while actually creating the conditions for confrontation. Leavitt had arrived with the posture and velocity of a woman who has spent the last 8 months mastering the White House briefing room, which is itself a live room under pressure, which is itself a form of preparation, and who had concluded, correctly, that the tools that work in the briefing room work everywhere. Pace, confidence, the personal framing of every question as an opportunity to redirect toward the preferred argument, the smile that arrives before the pivot as a signal that the pivot is coming and cannot be stopped. She had arrived prepared to perform. She had not arrived prepared for the document. Crockett had arrived with a folder. She had placed it on the desk in front of her at 7:44 p.m. before the cameras had gone to their opening configuration and had not touched it again until the moment she needed it. Her hands had been in her lap throughout the segment's opening exchanges, loose, settled, the hands of someone who is waiting rather than preparing, who has already prepared, and is now simply moving through time until the correct moment. The opening exchanges belonged to Leavitt. She took them with the efficiency and the grace of a professional at the height of her form. The specific, polished fluency of someone who has answered every version of every question so many times that the answers have become reflexive rather than considered, which is both the source of her competence and, as the evening would reveal, the archaeology of her vulnerability. She framed the administration's record. She framed Crockett's party's opposition as theatrical rather than substantive. She named Crockett's June 2025 comments, the ones that had described Trump supporters as sick, as an illustration of a mental health crisis, and she delivered her response to them with the practiced laugh she had used in the briefing room, the laugh that signals, "I have already won this exchange before it has begun." Crockett let the laugh finish. She did not respond to the June comments. She reached for the folder. She described the document before opening it, the way you describe a document when you want the person across the table to understand what is coming, not as a courtesy, but as a strategic choice, because the moment of description is the moment the room begins to understand the gap between what is about to be said and what the target of it has been saying. She named the platform Twitter, now X. She named the dates, a 17-month period between January 2018 and June 2019. She named the author Karoline Leavitt, then a White House intern, before her first campaign, before the press secretary role, before the professional identity had been constructed that the evening's performance had been built to maintain. She opened the folder. She looked at Leavitt across the desk. "You've had your 5 minutes," she said. Her voice was at the level of a moderator reading from a prepared text. Flat, specific, without editorial weight, because editorial weight would have diminished what the text was already doing. "Now let's find out why you're terrified of one question." She read the first tweet. It was 17 words. It had been written in January 2018, and it had described, in the specific, unguarded language of a 20-year-old on social media, a position on immigration enforcement that contradicted, with the flat, inescapable specificity of a primary source, the position that Leavitt had been publicly articulating from the White House podium for 8 months. Not a nuanced contradiction, a direct one, the kind that exists when a person says one thing at 20 and the opposite at 27, and both statements are in the public record and someone has found the first one. Leavitt's expression held. She began the response, the pivot, the reframe, the personal development narrative, the acknowledgement of growth, the redirect. Her voice had the efficiency and the confidence it always has. The studio audience produced a sound that was not yet a judgment. Crockett read the second tweet. It was 23 words. It had been written in March 2018, and it had described the administration's approach to international trade. The administration that Leavitt was now defending from the White House podium, in terms that were not critical of the position, but of the man holding it, with the specific, frank language of a person who had not yet decided whether that man would be useful to her career. Leavitt's pivot had not finished when the second tweet landed. Her expression adjusted, a micro-adjustment, the specific compression of a face that is understood that the folder has more than 2 entries. Crockett read the third tweet. It was 11 words, written in September 2018. It described the quality of Trump's public communication in a term that Leavitt had, 11 months later, stood at a White House podium and accused a member of the press corps of using inappropriately. The studio produced a sound that had nothing diplomatic in it. Leavitt's voice came back faster than before, which is the archaeology of a professional composure being tested. Not the silence, but the acceleration, the velocity increasing to fill the space that the silence would have created. She said the tweets were old, were out of context, were the product of a period before she had the information she now had, were being weaponized by a congresswoman who had herself said things, she named 2, that Crockett had never been asked to answer for. Her voice was still performing confidence, but the performance had become visible. And when a performance becomes visible, it is no longer a performance. It is a person trying to perform, which is a different and more readable thing. Crockett read the fourth tweet. This was the one. 29 words, October 2019. Not about policy, about character, about the specific quality of the man whose character Leavitt had been professionally defending. On camera, on the record, with the conviction of someone who had converted rather than calculated. Every working day for the previous 8 months. The words were specific. They were Leavitt's. They were unambiguous about what she had believed when she wrote them. And they were irreconcilable in the specific, flat, documentary way that primary sources are irreconcilable with what she had been saying from the podium. The freeze began, 9 seconds. The cameras held, the camera in position 1 on Crockett's face, which had not changed since she opened the folder, and the camera in position 2 on Leavitt's face, which was in the process of running through the infrastructure of a response that had not yet arrived. Her mouth opened. It did not produce words. It was not that she had nothing to say. Leavitt always has something to say, which is the source of her professional value. It was that the available responses had each, in the fraction of a second, her mind ran them, revealed their own cost. Denial. The document was on the screen. Recontextualization. The context had been read aloud. Personal attack. The document was her words, not Crockett's. The redirect. Crockett had closed the folder and was sitting with her hands in her lap and the flat, patient expression of someone who is not going anywhere and has already said the thing that needed to be said. 9 seconds. Then, those tweets don't represent who I am today. 11 words, delivered in a register that was not the briefing room register, not the performance register, but the register of a person speaking for herself rather than for an office, which is a different and more fragile thing. Crockett looked at her. Her voice was at its lowest, most specific point. They represent who you were when you weren't being watched, she said. 1 beat. This started with your words. She looked at the screen, where the fourth tweet was still displayed. It ends with your silence. She looked back at Leavitt. And your silence is the loudest thing in this room. A door near the production wing opened. A man, former senior digital communications director who had worked for 3 Senate campaigns and had specifically managed the social media archaeology process, the systematic review of a candidate's historical digital record before public exposure for each of the 3. His testimony was procedural. He described the process. He named the specific categories of historical content that the process identified as high risk, and he placed Leavitt's 4 tweets into those categories with the flat, professional specificity of a man reading a risk assessment. He said he had reviewed the same 17-month period that Crockett's folder had covered and had reached the same conclusions. He said the most significant finding was not any individual tweet, but the pattern. The specific, datable arc from the positions the tweets represented to the positions the White House podium represented, and the absence, in the public record, of any documented moment of change between the two. "I'm not betraying the family," he said, looking at the monitor rather than the camera. "I'm betraying a lie, specifically the lie that a 17-month Twitter record is private information." The second witness came through the same door 80 seconds later, a woman who had worked as a senior media analyst covering White House communications during the period of Leavitt's tenure, who had written the formal analysis of Leavitt's briefing room performance cited in 4 academic studies on political communication. She described the gap, the specific measurable distance between the rhetorical positions in the historical tweets and the rhetorical positions in the briefing room record, not as a political critique, but as a communication analysis. The same way a geologist describes a fault line, not good or bad, simply present, and present in a way that tells you something about the structure that exists above it. Her voice was steady throughout. Her hands were still. When Leavitt's communications team issued a statement during her testimony, calling the analysis politically motivated and professionally unqualified, she absorbed the characterization with the patience of someone whose work has been challenged before and whose methodology remains intact regardless. That belief, she said, cost me more than any lawsuit ever could have. The belief that documenting something accurately is the same as attacking someone personally. It isn't. It just feels that way to the person being documented. The studio's final sound came from multiple sections, the slow, convergent wave of hands coming together not in triumph but in recognition, the specific sound of a room that has witnessed something true and is responding to the truth rather than the performance. Crockett looked at the screen, where the 4th tweet remained. She looked at the desk. "The archaeology of this record," she said, her voice at the low, specific register it had held throughout, "doesn't require interpretation." She looked at the camera. "It requires a printout and a calendar." The studio gave the sound it gives when a line has arrived at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right register. Not laughter, not applause, but something that lives in the specific space where those two sounds meet, when the room knows that what it has witnessed is real. If this changed how you see power, hit subscribe. If it didn't, watch it again. The details you missed the first time are the ones that matter most. Notifications on. Next one drops soon.